Hello everyone and welcome to Chess 5, and today I'm going to show you not the game but today I'm going to show you how to crush Sicilian defense. I have chosen Sicilian defense because currently more than 80% of the players always go for the Sicilian defense against 1e4. That's why I have decided to show you a complete repertoire to destroy black Sicilian defense. And before starting the video, if you are new to my channel, then please subscribe to my channel, make sure for it. So without any further ado, let's dive into the game and see how can we crush Sicilian defense with the white pieces. After this video, I think you're going to be a pro to destroy the Sicilian defense. So without any further ado, let's dive into the game. So white starts with 1e4 and black plays c5, the Sicilian defense. And from move number 2, my preparation starts. Here at the place of knight to f3, I say to play d4. Yeah, the idea of playing d4 is here white is having a very nice center. So obviously the most natural move for black is to capture the pawn. Yeah, because if your white captures the pawn with the queen, he will play knight c6 and develop the piece with a tempo. But at the place of capturing a pawn, here white plays c3. That's my preparation. The idea of playing c3 is here white is preparing to capture the pawn with the pawn. Yeah, so many of the players will, I think perhaps 99% of the players is going to capture the pawn. Yeah, and after knight into c3, black is a pawn up. So after capturing up the pawn, white is going to capture up the pawn. So here white has successfully developed the one piece, and he is having a free flow of development. He can play knight f3, bishop to f4, bishop to c4, perhaps castle, and white is having a nice position. So after knight into c3, black also have to develop his pieces. So knight to c6, developing the pieces, right? And here white plays knight to f3, developing the piece. And now I'm going to discuss here black is having two options. He can play d6 or he can play e6. I'm going to discuss both of the options. First, let's look at e6. Yeah, after e6, the plan of black is to play bishop b4, developing the piece, and then break with the center by playing d5. If you play Sicilian defense, then you must know that black usually plays d5 to break the center. That's why Sicilian is played. So after e6, white plays bishop to f4, developing the piece, developing the third piece. So black has successfully developed his three pieces, and black has able to develop his one piece. So after bishop f4, black plays bishop to b4, logical move. Here black is developing the piece, and the second plan is now black is pinning up the knight on c3. So after bishop to b4, here white plays bishop to c4, developing his fourth piece. Yep, now white is just getting ready for the castle. So after bishop c4, here black is having two options. Here he can play knight f6 or knight g e7. Yep, because both the lines idea is to play d5. I'm going to discuss both of the move knight g e7 as well as of knight to f6. First, let's look at knight to f6. After knight f6, white is going to push the pawn to e5, attacking the knight on f6, and after pushing up the pawn to e5, black is going to play knight to e4. Here white knight can not capture the knight on e4 because the knight on c3 is pinned by the bishop on b4. So after knight to e4, here white should castle. Yeah, and here now white is getting ready to capture the knight on e4. So black have to capture the knight. Here white black is having two options. He can capture the knight with the bishop or with the knight. I'm going to discuss both of the options. So let's check it out. First, knight into c3. After knight into c3, white plays b into c3. Here comes bishop into c3, capturing up a pawn, and now black is 2 pawn up. Looks nice. And bishop is also now attacking the rook on a1. So white plays rook to c1, attacking, developing the piece and also attacking the bishop on c3. So bishop goes back to b4. Looks fine. And here white plays knight to g5. A very nice move by white. Yeah, the idea of knight to g5 is what can black play in this position. Here black is having two options. First, he can play h6, taking the knight from the g5 square, or second, he can simply castle. Let's check first castle. After black castles, here white is going to play bishop to d3. Another idea of white is to capture the pawn on h7. So there are two moves he can play. Black can play g6 or h6. g6 looks a very ugly move, but still for many players, for a low level player, many of the players still play it. So that's why I'm also covering the g6 line. So after g6, white plays a very nice move and very powerful move, which is knight into h7, sacrificing a piece for a pawn. And here black is not having much to do at the place of capturing, because the knight is also attacking the rook and he can come to f6 or perhaps. So king into h7 makes the most logical sense. And now comes queen to h5 check. Here the g6 pawn cannot capture the queen because the pawn is pinned. So black is having two options. He can play king g8 or king g7. If he play king g8, which makes the most logical sense, now comes bishop into g6, capturing up a pawn. And after f into g6, now comes queen into g6 check. Here king is forced to go to h8, and now white plays bishop to g5. The bishop is simply attacking the queen. So queen is having basically two plans, whether he can go queen e8 or whether he can play queen c7. Let's check it out. Queen e1, which makes the logical sense. He wants to trade the queens, as it looks like black is going to checkmate. So after queen e8, white is going to play bishop to f6 check, and king cannot go anywhere, so rook is forced to capture the bishop. And now comes simply queen into e8 with a check, and in the next move white is going to pick up the rook, and it's winning position for white. So that's why at the place of g6, here black plays. Let's discuss what will happen if black pushes the pawn to h6. After h6, in this position, white should play knight to h7, a very nice move by white. Here the knight is attacking the rook on f8, so the most natural move for black is to move the rook from the f8 square to e8. And now this is what white wants, and rook e8 looks the most natural move. But after rook e8, white plays knight to f6 check. Wow! The idea of knight f6 check is here the knight is attacking the rook with a check. So the most natural and a common move is to capture the knight on f6, right? After g into f6, here white is going to play queen to g5 check. And after king goes to f8, here black is having two options. He can go h8 or f8, but there is no more difference in both the moves. After king f8, white is going to play rook into c6. Wow! The basic idea of capturing of the knight is here black have to capture the rook, of course, because black position is completely destroyed. So the only chance for black is to win, to gain material. So black is having options to capture the rook with the b pawn or with the d pawn. If he captures with the d pawn, which looks the most sensible move, attack here. After capturing up the rook, he is opening up his queen. So after d into c6, now comes bishop into h6 check. Here black is forced to go to e7. Now comes queen into b4 check. Here many moves are winning for white. Many moves. Here even you can play e into f6 check. But e into f6 after king d7, queen into f4, queen into b4, queen into f6. It makes a little bit weakening for it. It makes the position equal if you don't know the line. So at the place of capturing up the pawn, you should simply play queen into b4 because it's a mate in 2. Yeah, because here black is forced to, if he plays king d7, then queen d6 is a checkmate. And if he pushes the pawn, then after queen into c5 check, here king d7, queen d6 is a checkmate. So this is not going to work. So now let's discuss what will happen. I have already discussed g6 line and the h6 line. So now we are going to discuss what will happen if after castle black decide to capture the knight with the bishop. After bishop into c3, white is going to capture the bishop, knight captures the pawn, which looks the most sensible move, and here comes queen to d3, developing the piece, also attacking the knight on c3. Here knight goes to a4, looks the most logical move. Here the knight can go to b6 perhaps, or even c5, attacking the queen, and from the b6 he can target the bishop. Here white plays knight to d4. The plan of playing knight to d4 is a very deep move. Here by playing knight to d2, here white is threatening to go to e4 and cover the d6 square. So if black castles, which looks the most natural move in this position, here white plays queen to g3. And although white is a 2 pawn down, but a serious attack is going to come by playing bishop h6, and it's going to be a very tremendous attack from the white side. So if black plays knight to b6, which looks somewhat like a move attacking the bishop on c4, then white will simply play bishop h6, and it's a forced checkmate. So black is forced to push the g pawn, and here at the place of capturing of the rook on f8, white will play bishop to d3, not going to give up the bishop on c4 for free. Obviously all the knight is protecting, but at the place of capturing up the rook, he should take the bishop back, because now white is having a bishop pair, so it is going to help white in the future. So after bishop d3, here black plays if d6, trying to open up the position. And or let's take rook to e8, which looks the most common move from the black side, because the bishop was attacking the rook. And after rook to e8, white plays knight to e4. A very nice move by white. Here there are many threats of white. First of all, he can perhaps play knight d6, or second he can even play knight to f6 with a check, and it's completely winning position and crushing position for white. So that's why I think knight to b6 idea is not going to work in this position. So let's check it out. Knight to e7. Yeah, because knight e7 looks the natural move. He wants to put the knight on g6. Now bishop h6 is not longer going to work. So after knight e7, white is going to play bishop to d3. The idea of playing bishop to d3 is, here white is basically getting all his pieces on the king side to prepare a very deadly attack. Something like bishop into h7 can happen in the future after white is first prepared to play knight e4, and then he would be having 4 pieces in the attack, and if black would not be able to understand the position, then he's just going to get smashed easily. So the most logical move in this position looks d6, right? Because after playing d6, black is saying that he wants to open up the position. So after d6, in this position, white is going to play knight to f3, simply developing the piece. And in this position, if black decides to capture up the pawn on e5, now comes a very fantastic move by white, not capturing up the pawn, but capturing up the h7 pawn with the bishop. Wow! Here black is having nothing much to do. He have to capture the bishop, and now comes knight to g5 check. And usually black is having 2 squares to go to g8 or to g6. If he comes to g6, now comes knight into e6, and it's a check. And in the next move, white is simply going to pick up the queen, and it's completely winning position for white. So after king to g8, in this position, white is going to play queen to h3. Simple move. and now there's a checkmate on the h7 square. So actually in this position black is not having much to do because it's very hard to stop the checkmate. So the most natural move is to play rook e8, making a square for the king to go. Now come queen to h7 check still. After king f8, white is going to play queen to h8 check. Here the fourth move fall back is to take the knight back to g8, and now comes knight to h7 check. Here comes king e7. Now comes bishop to g5 check at the place of capturing of the pawn, and now it's a pin. So black have to play f6 to attack the bishop, and now comes queen into g7 with a check. So king have to move, and now comes here actually many moves are winning. You can even play rook f d1, capturing up the queen and just completely winning position for white. So this is what happens if black will capture up the knight on c3. And actually I've showed you both the moves, what will happen in the game. So I think you are pretty prepared with the move if black plays e6 in this position. So if we have discussed e6 variation, now let's discuss d6 variation, because d6 variation is also very common. The idea of playing d6 from black side, now black is preparing to play g6, bishop g7, knight f6, or bishop to g4. Sorry, my mistake. I didn't consider this. I have considered knight f6, but I didn't consider knight g7. So now let's consider first knight ge7. After knight ge7, white is going to simply castle, and black is also going to castle the same. And after black castles, white plays bishop to d6. Very nice move by white. Here the threat of white is perhaps to capture the bishop. Perhaps this is a pin, the knight cannot move from the e7 square. So the best and the logical move from black side is to capture the bishop. And after bishop into d6, white plays queen into d6. And if you look this position at closely, here black all pieces have been blocked. He can't even open up this position by playing d5 as the queen is on d6. And white, if I talk about the white pieces are just pretty amazingly placed. So after queen into d6, here black plays b6, a logical move. Here black wants to play bishop g7, perhaps queen b8, trying for rook trade or queen trade, or perhaps rook c8 then queen c7. There could be some ideas like this. So after b6, now white plays rook f to d1, developing his fifth piece. And now he just wants rook ac1, and his all pieces would be simply developed. So here black is not having much to do. He have to develop his pieces. So the most common move is bishop b7, giving up a pawn, but he have to play this position, or what he can play in this position. White plan is simply ready. He wants to play rook c1, perhaps knight to b5, perhaps knight to c7, attacking the rook, and black would get simply crushed. That's why the most logical move looks bishop b7, giving up a pawn. So white captures the pawn on d7. Here comes queen into d7, rook into d7, attacking the bishop on b7. So black plays rook a b8, protecting the bishop. And now the plan of black is to play rook f to d8, asking for a rook trade. So after rook a b8, white is simply going to play rook a d1, and black is going to play rook f to d8. And if you look at this position closely, if you compare the materials, the material is completely equal. And if you talk about the position, so white have successfully managed to develop all his pieces. And if I talk about black is in a passive way. His all pieces are in a passive mode. So I think white is better in this position, and if you are a fine player, you are going to able to convert this position. So my preparation was still here, and I think white is having a pretty nice position in this point. Perhaps white can play knight b5, perhaps targeting this pawn, perhaps bishop b5, perhaps h3, perhaps moving the knight and gaining more space with the f4 f5 stuff like that. White is having a complete fine position. So after I have shown you this knight e7 also line. So now let's discuss about the d6 variation. Yeah, because d6 variation is also played. So after d6, white is going to play bishop to c4, developing the piece, the most natural move. After bishop to c4, here black is going to play knight to f6, the most natural move in any position. Yeah, because he have played d6 and white can no longer push his pawn because the d6 pawn is protecting the e5 pawn. But after knight to f6, white is going to push e5, a very nice move by white. Here black is having a very less options. He can capture the pawn with the knight or with the pawn, or he can move the knight to g4. Let's discuss the variation, what will happen if black captures the pawn, which looks the most natural move. If he captures the pawn with the knight, then you are going to simply win the game, because white is simply going to capture the knight back. Here comes d into e5, and now comes the very powerful move by white, which is bishop into f7 check. Wow, here the king cannot move, something like this, because queen is simply covering this file. King is forced to capture the bishop on f7, and here comes simply queen into d8, and white is a queen plus, and he is going to win the game. So knight into e5 is not going to work. So now let's discuss d into e5. After d into e5, white is going to play queen into d8 check. Here black plays king into d8. The knight into d8 is also possible. I'm going to calculate both the variations. If king into d8, white is going to play knight to g5. A very nice move. Idea is, at the place of capturing the pawn directly with f7, here white played knight to g5, and now the threat is to capture the f7 pawn with the knight, and it's a check, and the rook is hanging on h8. So the best move for black in this position is to play knight to a5. Yeah, basically if now white takes the f7 pawn, then he will play king e8, and after capturing up the rook, he will play knight into c4, and the knight is trapped on h8, and actually this position is better for black. That's why after knight a5, white is going to play bishop into f7, capturing up the pawn with the bishop. So here the most common move looks like h6, attacking the knight on g5. So after h6, white is going to play knight to e6 check. Here black simply captures up the knight, because this looks the most natural move. Because playing king d7 looks a tremendous bad move. That's why bishop into e6 looks the most natural move. Here comes bishop into e6, and black plays g5. He have to play g5 because his pawns are just stopping his bishop. So he have to open up the position by playing g5. We're trying to play bishop g7. Perhaps, sorry, wrong arrow. Perhaps king f7, king c7, then rook d8. This can be the plan of black. After g5, white is going to strike immediately by playing h4. A very nice move by white. Here the threat of white is to capture up the pawn on g5. Here black cannot do much. If he captures up the pawn back, then white is going to simply capture up the pawn with the rook, and white is completely better in this position. If let's take bishop g7, developing a piece, then white is going to play bishop to e3, developing his fourth piece, and in the next move he's going to perhaps castle, or perhaps he can even play rook d1. And if you count the pawns, here black is a pawn up, but if you look at the position, I don't know what black wants to do and what is his idea. The knight on a5 is just completely bad. Bishop on g7 is also completely bad, and I don't know what is the idea of black. And if I talk about white is having a perfect coordination with the white pieces, and perhaps he can play rook d1 and target these e5 and e7 pawn, because these two pawns are the isolated pawn and are tremendously weak. So it can be a nice move. So What will happen if black doesn't capture the pawn on h4 and play bishop to g7, which looks the sensible move for the black side. Now white will simply capture up the pawn. Yep. Black captures it back, and now comes rook into h8 check, bishop into h8, bishop into g5, and in this position white is a material is even. And if I talk about position, white is having a bishop pair. The bishop of black on h8 is very bad, the knight on a5 is also very bad, and the pawn on e7 and e5 are the isolated pawns, and the pawns are very tremendously weak and just completely winning position for white. So that's why this is what will happen if he will capture up the pawn with the pawn. After capturing up, after queen takes, I have discussed king into. Now let's discuss what will happen if knight grabs the queen on d8. After knight into d8, white is going to play knight to b5. A very nice move by white. Here the idea of playing knight to b5, here knight is threatening to come to c7 and make a threat on the king as well as the rook. So the most natural move is to play rook to b8. Here black cannot play king to d7 because there is a mate in 2, because now comes simply knight into e5 check, king goes to e8, and knight to c7 is a checkmate. So that's why king to d7 is not possible. So black is forced to play rook to b8 so that after knight c7 the rook will not be hanging on a8. But still white is going to play knight to c7 check. Here comes king d7 and knight to b5 back. And now black can no longer castle as he have moved the king. So after knight to b5, black plays king e8 because white is threatening to capture up the pawn on e5. So king e8. Here still white captures up the pawn on e5, and now the threat is to perhaps, for now there is no threat because the knight is covering the pawn, but perhaps knight c7 can be a threat. So the most logical move look e6. Yeah, now there is no future pressure on the f7 pawn. So after e6, white is going to play simply castle, a very calm move. After castle, black plays a6, attacking the knight on b5. Here white simply plays knight to c7 check, king e7, the fourth move for black. Here comes rook d1, a very nice move for white. And in this position, I don't know what black is going to play in this position. Like white have all his pieces developed nicely, and if I talk about material, all the black is a pawn up, but where is the coordination of black pieces? His rook and bishop is just completely dead. His rook on b8 is completely dead. His bishop on c8 is completely dead. If even black plays b5 in the position, trying to open up the position, after b5, white is going to play a very fantastic move in this position, which is bishop to e3, saying, okay, you can grab my bishop, I'm going to simply play bishop c5 checkmate. That's why black cannot capture the bishop also. So the best move for black is to play knight to e4, somehow protecting the square on c5. And in this position, white is going to play actually bishop e2, bishop d3, bishop b3, everything is winning for white. Let's take bishop e2, which makes the most sense, and the idea of white is to play bishop to f3 or even f3. The idea is to simply checkmate, and actually it's very hard. It's very hard for black to even equalize the game. It's completely winning for white. So this is what happened when black captures up the pawn on e5. So now the only single line is remaining. What will happen if black plays knight to g4 at the place of capturing up the pawn on e5? After knight g4, white is going to play here. He's going to simply capture up the d6 pawn. And after queen into d6, white is going to castle, not going to capture up the queen. So capturing up the queen looks the most sense as black is a pawn up. So going into the end game makes the most logical sense for white. So after rook into d1, if you compare the material, black is a pawn up, and if you compare the position, white have all his pieces nicely developed, and white has also even castled. And now if I talked about black pieces, I don't know what the knight is doing on g4. I don't know what the bishop on f8 and the rook on h8 is doing. And I also don't know what the king on e8 is doing and the rook on 8 is doing. There is no hope for the black pieces in the complete game. So after rook into d1, here black plays bishop to f5, developing the piece. So here white plays h3, first kicking the knight from the g4 square. So knight goes to e5, trying to trade the piece. Here white simply captures up the knight. Knight into e5. Here comes knight to b5, a very fantastic move by white. Here saying, okay, you can grab my knight. Here you can grab my bishop on c4. I will simply play knight to c7 and it's a checkmate. So that's why knight cannot capture the bishop on c4. So the best and the logical move for black in this position is to play rook c8, covering the c7 square for the knight. Here white plays bishop to d5, a very nice move by white, preparing to capture up the pawn on b7. So black plays knight to c6, the most logical move. Here white simply grabs the knight. Here black is having option to capture up the bishop with the pawn or with the rook. Here the rook capturing of the with rook looks the most natural move. Here if black captures the bishop with the pawn, then knight will simply capture up the a7 pawn and it's a double attack. So after rook c7, it looks like white knight is trapped on a7, but here comes bishop e3, developing his second last piece, and the bishop on e3 is simply protecting the knight on a7, and in the next move he is going to play rook c1 and going to capture up the c6 pawn and then going to simply push his a and b pawn and going to win the game. That's why capturing up the bishop with the pawn makes no sense. So capturing up with the rook makes the only sense. So after rook into c6, here white plays knight to d4, attacking the rook on c6 as well as the bishop on f5. So here black plays rook to d6, the most natural and the common move, pinning up the knight. Here the knight cannot capture the bishop because the rook is hanging on d1, and this is now completely winning position for black. So after rook to d6, white plays bishop to f4, developing the piece with a tempo and attacking the rook on d6. So here black plays rook to d5, here protecting the bishop, and here white will simply capture the bishop on f5. Here black cannot capture the rook because now the rook is protected by the a1 rook. So rook is forced to capture up the knight, and now comes, and in this position, if I talk about this position, it's completely winning position for white, because here white is simply going to play bishop e3. And the idea of playing bishop to e3, here the bishop is attacking the pawn on a7, so black somehow play b6, now protecting the a7 pawn. And after b6, white is going to simply play rook a to c1, developing his final piece into the game. And now the threat of white is to simply play rook to c8 checkmate, a very nice threat. So the only move in this position for black is to push the pawn to f6 if he doesn't want to get checkmated. If he plays e6, trying to open up his bishop, then white is going to play rook to c8 check. Here black is having the only move, king to e7, and now comes rook a8, attacking the pawn on a7. So black plays rook a5, protecting the pawn and also attacking the white a2 pawn. Here white plays bishop to d2, and if in this position, if black captures up the a2 pawn, which looks the most natural move, here white gives a check on b4, king is forced to go to f6, and now white is going to simply capture up the bishop on f8, and white is a piece up and he's going to win the game. So that's why e6 is not possible. So f6 is the best move according to Engine also. So after f6, white is going to play a4. The idea of playing a4 here white is preparing to play b3, and then he will go with the attack by playing rook c7. So if black plays e6, which looks one of the common move to trying to open up this position by playing perhaps bishop e7 or king f7. If e6, then white is going to play rook to c8 check, king f7, Then comes rook to d7 check, king g6. Now comes rook into a7, and this is winning position for white. He has equalized the material is equal first of all, and then white is simply going to white is simply going to capture up the b6 pawn and going to push his a and b pawn, and black can't do anything. So e6 is not possible. So at the place of e6, if black plays rook to a5, which looks a nice move. Here black is attacking the pawn on a4, and after rook a5, white is going to play b3, pushing up the pawn and also protecting up the a4 pawn. After b3, if black plays g5, because there is nothing in this position, he have to open up the position with g5, bishop g7. So after g5, which looks the most natural move for black, here comes rook to c8 check, king is forced to go to f7. Now comes rook to d7, and white looks completely winning in this position. So if black plays bishop g7, trying to trade the rooks, here white is not going to trade the rooks. He is going to play rook c to c7, and now the threat is to capture the a7 pawn, and the second threat is to capture up the e7 pawn. So the best move for black in this position is to play rook e8, protecting up the e7 pawn, and here white is simply going to capture up the a7 pawn, and after rook into a7, white is going to soon capture the b6 pawn and going to push his a and b pawn, and black can't even stop his pawns. So it's completely winning position for white. So guys, this was, I think, all the lines. I have showed you all the lines to how to crush black Sicilian defense. If any line or any move you have doubt, then please tell me in the comment section. I will solve your doubt. If you like this trap, that how can white simply crush black Sicilian defense by sacrificing one pawn, if you are attacking player, then I think you should go for this line. And if you like this whole variation, whole repertoire, then please like to my video. I have it's very tiring that to create such long preparation, as the video is also for 40 minutes long. So if you like this video, then please like to my video. If you are new to my channel, then please subscribe to my channel. I will come up with these new videos for you, so please stay tuned. Thank you for watching, and bye bye.